Welcome everybody, online and on site. I'm Cameron Kerry. I'm the Anne and Andrew Tisch Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at Brookings in the Governance Studies program. Today is my first time in this room for a public program in more than 3 years. So you are very welcome here. Our topic today on AI is one that we have seen explode into the mainstream in the last few months as generative AI and particularly ChatGPT moving to record adoption for a consumer application in a matter of weeks, and that has really made the broad public raise a lot of questions about what the potential is, the limitations, and the impacts of artificial intelligence. And as an indicator of kind of that level of interest and the amount that people are thinking of it, I have never seen as many questions come in online for a public program at Brookings as we received for this one. Literally hundreds of questions, and extremely thoughtful and informed questions. So people are really thinking about it. And our panelists today have done a lot of thinking about this issue. They are experts in the field, and they've brought that expertise to the National AI Advisory Committee. The NIACC, as we'll call it, was created by statute and tasked to look at America's competitiveness in AI and at the other issues involved. They met yesterday and today. They have released a draft report. This will be the first public opportunity to discuss that outside their meetings. They are here to speak as experts, not for the NIACC. And the final report on this draft will be released, and maybe we'll hear about that. So I'm going to go down the row here and just very briefly introduce our panelists, and they'll say a little bit more about themselves. But to my left is Miriam Vogel. She is the president and CEO of Equal AI. It's a nonprofit that focuses on responsible and equitable AI. Next to her is Swami Siva Subramanian, who is a data scientist who's VP for Data and Machine Learning at AWS. And I should acknowledge that Amazon is a generous supporter of the Brookings Governance Studies program. And that support helps make possible the work that we do. I also want to underscore Brookings' independence and commitment to that, and that the views today, whether it's the speakers or the moderators, are people's own. So after Swami, we have Susan Gonzalez. She is the founder and CEO of AI and You, a nonprofit that engages and educates marginalized communities on AI and emerging technologies. And then Reggie Townsend, VP for Data Ethics and Practice at SAS Institute, the largest privately owned software company in America. And the other end of the stage is my Brookings colleague, Jessica Brandt, who is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program and director of the Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technologies Program at Brookings. So together we will explore the issues raised by AI and addressed in the NIACC's work. There'll be an opportunity for Q&A, both from the audience present here and online. People can use the hashtag that's on the board there, hashtag #NationalAI, to send in questions. So as we move into the discussion, I want to invite you, Miriam, to just give us a little bit of an overview of the NIACC and its work and the issues addressed in your draft report.
Thank you very much, Cam, for the opportunity to talk about our report and also to clarify that we are all here in our own capacity speaking from our individual experiences, and that's how we serve on NIACC, really. So there's 26 of us, and each of us work in organizations related to this field, but really appointed each in our individual capacity. And so it's a privilege to be able to have this conversation currently and over the past year. So as Cam mentioned, we were created by congressional mandate, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020. We were formed officially last April and convened for the first time May 4th of last year in a lovely event in your former home at the Department of Commerce, where Secretary Raimondo launched us with Dr. Lori Locascio. I believe it was her first public engagement. It's been a lifetime since then for her, I'm sure, with all that NIST has done in the last year. And we had representatives from the White House, Dr. Alondra Nelson, Dr. Lynn Parker. We also had Deputy Secretary Graves, who launched us with clarity on our marching orders. And that, again, by congressional mandate, was to advise the President and the White House National AI Initiative Office on AI policy. And the mandate is both narrow and broad. It's narrow in our audience. A clear reading, a strict reading, as we've done, is to the President and the White House, and on AI policy. But within that, they mentioned several specific areas. And so for our first year, we wanted to make sure to address those areas specifically because it's a 3-year term. And so we started with that focus and immediately organized ourselves into 5 working groups. And those were trustworthy AI, research and development, workforce, international collaboration, and competitiveness. And competitiveness was focused on several times within the statute. They talk about the National AI Initiative Office, its setup, its mandate, and really alignment across the executive branch to ensure competitiveness for the U.S. on AI policy. There was also a note of a specifically mandated subcommittee on law enforcement, and so we followed our mandate and called for that within our first meeting. And the Secretary has now signed off on those members, and so that will be launched in the near term. And we'll look forward to working with them on their really important specific issue. And we're glad there's a full subcommittee just expressly looking at that issue. While in the meantime, we've had the privilege of looking at these 5 areas, again, both narrow and broad, depending on once you delve in, you see all the people you're touching, all the ways that AI is revolutionizing the world, both within the government, how the government regulates and has clear lines of authority, and thinking about the people impacted by AI as well, and the way that government can and should impact, protect, and optimize who's able to benefit from AI while making sure that people are not harmed or discriminated against AI. And so it's a privilege for us to be having this conversation throughout the last year. It just process-wise, we've met 4 times. We had our second meeting in Palo Alto. At that meeting, we were fortunate to hear from Kim and several others because each working group invited experts on areas where we intended to focus within our first year. And it's online. Our discussions and panels are online. I highly recommend that for anyone who wants to learn more about the specific areas we convened, because each panelist and each panel was really insightful, really thought-provoking, and really educational. And we then, in our next meeting in North Carolina, started talking about the proposals we wanted to focus on for our first year report, which Kim mentioned is still in draft form. I brought a copy to, in case I needed to, thank you. In case I needed to reference it for any points, being a lawyer, I didn't want to get off the points here. And so we have these for reference. It's posted online on NIACC.gov, on ai.gov/NIACC. And so you can see the draft report there. We, as Kim mentioned, had our public discussion on this report yesterday, again at the Department of Commerce. And so you could there see everyone's insights and input on the committee and what went into the objectives and the action items within this first year's draft report.
That's great. Thanks again for that important context. As you mentioned, each of you comes to this committee, from doing important work in your own right, and I just love to draw you out on what brought you to this work. And a year in, what's the one sort of most important takeaway you want policymakers to draw from your work so far?
Well, I'll start. I actually started. I became interested in AI when I was at Facebook about 8 years ago, and this new technology at the time I thought was really cool because it was allowing the disabled community to access the platform. And my personal interest and passion has always been marginalized communities, women, people of color, disabled, and others, LGBTQ. So at that point, I just started following AI and learning a lot from the engineers. And I found myself often saying, oh, so what you mean is. And I realized soon thereafter, after I left the company to do my own thing, I focused on AI, and it became very clear very quickly that the AI ecosystem, particularly in Silicon Valley, was just talking to itself. We have a lot of problems. And this was back when, facial recognition was getting pulled back, and it was just a mess. But then I realized the rest of the world is over here, and these are particularly marginalized communities, and there was no connection. And that's when I decided to launch a nonprofit to focus specifically on that, to focus on educating communities about the fundamentals of AI. I mean, in so much as an algorithm is like a recipe for cupcakes. It's a recipe that makes the internet work. It makes AI work. So that's where my interest is, and I'm super privileged to have this position to be able to ensure and that we are, as a working group and as a committee itself, inclusive in voices that typically are not included in this type of conversation. And so, that's, and fortunately with Miriam's leadership and the rest of the crew, we're definitely doing that. And so I'm looking forward to, particularly year 2, to really dive into that and to engage other stakeholders and get feedback accordingly.
I'll jump in on that. So at SAS, we provide AI tools, a platform, if you will. And so as a consequence, I get a chance to meet a number of colleagues, brilliant folks. And while I'd always had some casual interest in AI and gone and done some self-learning, I had, I think like many of us often do in this space, kind of had an oh crap moment. And for me, it was after talking with some colleagues and getting kind of introduced to some of the issues associated with bias and what have you, then spending a little more time looking at documentaries and these sorts of things, and I had that moment. And I decided it made more sense to be a part of the solution rather than, sitting on the sidelines and just watching to see what happened. For me coming, to this as an African American man, I thought about it as, wow, here's an opportunity for Jim Crow 3.0, and I don't like the way that looks and feels. And so, many months later, led the development of what we now have as a data ethics practice at SAS, and was nominated to participate in this work. What I've learned, though, and what I think people really need to understand is that we all have those moments that there's a lot of potential risk and harm, and that's all very true. But at the same time, there are a lot of upside, there's a lot of potential rewards, and there are a lot of us in this space who are invested in both sides of that equation. And so I would encourage folks to get a little more involved and informed about the space, and maybe, just maybe, it might ease up some of the feelings that you get when you have that oh crap moment.
Yeah. So, Swami, I'm dying to hear what you have to say, because both Susan and Reggie were at tech companies and had what Reggie politely describes as an oh crap moment, dealing with engineers and saying, okay, wait a second, there's a blind spot here. You are an engineer, a scientist. So how does this look from your end?
So just jumping in, I'm an engineer by training. I still write code, although not so much on a daily basis nowadays. I joined Amazon before AWS existed. I don't know, for folks who don't know AWS, it is like our cloud computing division, which essentially first started with the notion of making all the IT resources accessible without having to raise huge amount of capital. That drove a whole wave of how startups actually now get going. So to me, having built some of the initial days as an intern and as an engineer, and then I've been with AWS since the early days, in a literal way, I kind of had an oh crap moment where literally I was on a paternity leave, changing diapers for my daughter and playing with deep learning systems. And I got excited on the possibilities of how amazing these technologies are. And as a background, my PhD is not in machine learning. It is on a different field of computer science and large-scale distributed systems. So during my paternity leave, in between my downtime and whatnot, so I was teaching myself deep learning. And then when I came back from paternity leave, I kind of told my leadership team, okay, now I know what we need to do in AWS to make machine learning accessible for everyone, not just people who have PhD in machine learning, which is effectively what it used to be 6 to 8 years ago, which led to all the tools we built in AWS. And I kind of feel like now we are, and at that time I thought we were having a transformation in terms as an industry, but now that transformation in machine learning is accelerating even more in terms of this is, the rate of transformation in technology has never been this rapid ever since like probably the advent of internet. And that is kind of like wild when you think about the age where we are living in. And so much of things are going to actually change. And that is very exciting. And it is important to be part of a community that enables this transformation, but also actually helps shape in terms of how we actually put this to work. And that's what I'm excited professionally, but also excited to work with such incredible, smart people. As I was publicly stating it yesterday, I'd never been in a policy committee. These people are too nice to accommodate a geek to be part of this crowd. But anyway, it's a privilege.
The takeaway is, I think all of us saw that there's the flip side of the positive and the negative. I think each of us, it's fair to say, is really excited about the innovation opportunities here, about the ways that AI currently fuels our life. I mean, it's hard to imagine what the pandemic would have been like if we didn't have Zoom and other mechanisms that made our life still interconnected and feasible. So on a daily basis, I don't drive anywhere without using a GPS system. I don't finish half of my sentences. Gmail sometimes gets them wrong, but when it gets it right, it's so nice to quickly finish. From small ways like that to the important ways that we can use AI in education, that we can use it in life-saving advances. But we also realize that we're at a critical crossroads because this tool can also be a weapon. And what's so important about this weapon is not just that it can be misused, but that it can be scaling discrimination. That lines of code and iterations of code can undo decades of progress, and the perpetrator may not know it. And so I think one thing we all recognize is also the power of this moment, and I think it's been very encouraging to see how many people, both in industry, in academia, civil society, and in the government, are savvy to the power of this moment, and that we have this opportunity to correct past wrongs and do better.
So a critical crossroads, and that's certainly, I think, the case as people see the ways, look or start to consider the ways that AI may transform the way that everybody works. And traditionally, the sort of higher level thinking and intuitive thinking job categories have been considered out of that. Now it's everybody. We are thinking here at Brookings about what the implications of generative AI are for our work. So I know workforce was a big issue for the committee, and certainly looking over the questions that we've got, it was probably the most salient issue there. So, Reggie, Susan, you were both members of the workforce working group. I'd love to hear about the role that you foresee for AI or the future of work and the impact of that, and the sectors or job categories that would be the most affected. And then it's a two-parter, so a follow-up on what we do about that.
Okay, well, I'll get started. What I find interesting is, well, first of all, with ChatGPT, I would venture to say most of our families and a lot of people think AI's here, not understanding that actually the minute you picked up your device this morning, you were using AI, and that started years ago. So it's interesting, which has sped everything up, right? And then when it comes to the workforce, if you notice, now that I mention it, you might notice, but today's narrative, if you think about a ladder, the lower third, a lot of conversation about K through 12, and a lot of investment there, and there needs to be. And then the top third, a lot of investment into grad students to encourage them to get PhDs in AI. But the missing piece in the narrative are workers. And maybe one of the good things that's come out of ChatGPT is, to your point, Cam, is that I've read and seen things. Well, now administrative workers are going to be affected, and all kinds of more mid-level workers. And so I'll let Reggie talk to more about what we did or what the committee did. But from my perspective, that's the missing piece right now. It's not just about, the conversation used to be about, we need to get everybody to go to STEM, get an education in STEM and get a PhD, and we need more computer science people, and we need, true. But again, it's real. And so who's the voice, right? Who's the voice of the workers when it comes to AI? Who's educating the workers about what it is? I heard from a teacher who was representing a teachers union in Baltimore, and she said, Yeah, I get a lot of these companies come to me and say, I have the AI tool that is going to change your life. And her response was, I don't even know what AI is, so how can I embrace this tool? I have no idea. So I think we, the big we, are overlooking that about giving workers fundamental information to make decisions.
Yeah, so look, Susan's right. You know, AI has been with us for quite some time. But I think it's fair to say this is a watershed moment. I like to say, you know, back when we started seeing the benefit of large language models last November, you know, now everyone knows how to spell AI. So that's a good thing, right? That's a net good. But we have to be honest about this as well, which is to say there will be displacement, right? If anybody's gone to your local convenience store, you can see that there has been displacement in the retail sector. You know, people who used to be your clerks checking you out have been substituted with, you know, machines. Banking, we've seen it with ATMs. But that was long ago. We got used to that. You know, when the internet first started, we were like, I am not paying anything over this computer, and now it's kind of commonplace. And so I'll just paint these parallels to say that there is progression that occurs with this stuff. And over time, we come to accept and acquiesce, we refine it, etc. That's been our path so far. This watershed moment feels a little bit different, though, and I think it feels different because of the urgency attached to it and the rapid nature at which it came, right? We got, and we keep referring to ChatGPT, but I mean, there are other large language models, but we'll just use that one for the sake of the conversation. They dropped that in November, and then all of a sudden you got the next version of it, like 4 months later, that was exponentially better. And so I think that quickness creates a level of urgency that we feel, and I think that's a natural feeling. So I think it is important for us to be wide-eyed about possibilities of displacement and people in more vulnerable situations need to understand what skills might be necessary to upskill or shift left or right, and all of that's fair game. I think what we owe and what we've attempted to put in the big we, and again, we're here not speaking on behalf of the NIACC. Go check out the draft report and all that sort of stuff that the attorneys tell us we have to say. If you take a look at the material, what you'll see is that what we've attempted to do early on is provide some tactical things that government can do to begin to assess the landscape, right? Where are skills today? Where do skills need to be tomorrow? And how does the government provide industry and others with the tools and the elements that they'll need to start to make some decisions out in the marketplace? And so that was the first step. And then hopefully we'll be able to be a little more precise with some other things in the future, but that had to be a necessary first step, right? Make no mistake about it, this is a moment. And those who might be impacted, you talked about folks at kind of the service level economy or people who are knowledge workers. Yeah, this technology can come for all of us, but it doesn't have to substitute us. And oftentimes what we're seeing today anyway is that it's either augmenting in certain spaces. You know, I know Swami does a lot with developers, and so you see a lot of developers who typically would do very rudimentary things like testing. Now you can farm some of that out to a co-pilot, and then they can use their artistry, if you will, on some of the other development-related activities. So I think over time we will start to kind of weave this in or integrate it with our lives, much like we have with the ATM and others. But this moment requires us to be intentional about it, and I think that's kind of what we're feeling.
Mm-hmm. So I know your focus, Miriam told us, is, you know, under your charter is basically what does the government need to do, what does the president and other agencies need to do. But from your standpoint, how do businesses and individuals prepare for this future? How do we ensure that the teachers who have to deal with AI in the classroom have the ability to do that?
Well, I can just share from the work that I do that what's interesting about this topic is, for the most part, people don't know what they need, that they even need to know this. I think people still think of AI as, the Matrix or Star Wars, and now it's Chat GPT, and that's what AI is. And so that is an incredibly challenging piece of this work, is helping people understand why they should know, why they need to know that when you apply for a loan on your phone, that the AI tool will track how many mistakes you make, or on any application, and you're probably going to make more mistakes on your phone, and you might get declined for a loan because of that. I mean, these are like fundamental points regarding AI tools that people are interacting with every day. So that is the greatest challenge. I think, how do we prepare? I think we have the conversation, and some of the work we're going to be doing together in this coming year is just that, about education and awareness about AI. And again, it's not about getting people to get CS degrees, computer science degrees. It's about what are the fundamentals so people can understand what they're actually touching every single day.
Yeah, so I want to echo that, and we said it in public comment yesterday, so we can say it now. So we'll have a focus on awareness and education so we can start to answer that question a little more explicitly, Cam. But I think the fundamental is we've got to kind of raise our baseline as a society. There's a baseline of understanding that we all have to have. I use the analogy of electricity. Like, I'm assuming no one in this room probably went to school to be an electrician or maybe a nuclear physicist or something, but everyone knows something about electricity, and you probably didn't go to school to learn it. And so we've got to raise our level of common understanding about AI, similar to the way we all know not to put a fork in the sockets in this room. So that'll be the kind of thing that we focus on, because I think it's important, to Susan's point, that we don't turn this conversation into, how can we turn everyone into a computer scientist? Like, not everybody, I'm not a computer, I don't want to be a friggin' computer scientist, right? All right. So how can we make sure that the artists and the teachers and the mechanics and the baristas understand the impact of AI in their lives? And so I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago talking to an audience, and I said, start from where you are. Just whatever it is you do, whatever your hobbies are, just think about, first go get some familiarity with it. Just go out on the internet and Google AI, fundamentals, or AI for dummies, or whatever. There's no shortage of information about this stuff. But then start from where you are and figure out how it might apply to your life, right? So the good thing, if I might, about some of the stuff that's coming out with the fake Drake, right? The whole, Drake and being the deep fakes in the with the weekend, the deep fakes. So the good thing is that's creating public conversation, right? I think that's a net good. Now, certainly we have to deal with issues of copyright and IP, and all this stuff is very real, especially to artists. Very, very real, so we can't overlook that. But at least it's creating an opportunity for us to see that, wow, this affects me. Even if I'm just a consumer of music, how do I feel about consuming music that was generated by AI as opposed to by a human artist? Am I feeling that or not? Right? And so just, again, start from where you are and then start to figure out how AI might be to your net benefit or potential risk to your well-being.
I'll probably just add, even computer engineers had to learn AI. Right now, internally, like we have our AI coding companion tool called Code Whisperer. That when developers turn that on, they are able to do things 57% faster. So it's and even many times they are resistant to turn it on because people are always hesitant to pick up new ways of doing things. It's just human nature. So the biggest takeaway, Fedi, is AI has a potential to impact every industry, and almost all of us have to retool ourselves on what kind of tools am I going to do in the future to use my job. It'll make us more productive and do things a little differently, but it'll also improve our end goal in the future as well. So this is true for developers as well. But the key thing is to expose people that the art of possible and what these tools will be there so that they know instead of treating it as an abstract thing that will come 10, 15 years later. So.
And I think a theme here is demystifying AI. We're not all going to be computer programmers, nor do we all want to be, but we each have a really important role to play in engaging with AI because we do. So we have to understand what it is that is fueling our economy and our lives. And not only is it important as an individual to understand what it is that that AI is fueling so many important functions, but our country depends on it. If we don't have more people participating in the process with a broad array of perspectives, our AI will suffer. There's study after study that show that the broader diversity in who is developing and comprising, who is building your AI, the better your AI system will be. And again, that doesn't mean everyone needs to be a computer scientist, but think about throughout the AI life cycle, each human touch point is an opportunity for bias and other harms, cyber intrusions, et cetera, to embed. Each is also an opportunity for us to identify and remediate that discrimination. But what that requires is that the people at each touch point, starting from the beginning of creating an AI solution, right now, those who have been to date enabled to create an AI solution are very privileged that they have access to that opportunity. Well, these large language models have changed that because now the language of coding is English or whatever language you speak. And now you can use these large language models and other emerging technology to fuel you to engage yourself in using AI to support you. So is it fair that we expect teachers to all of a sudden teach this new language? Probably not. But if we demystify how ChatGPT doesn't take over their job, but rather can help support them. I mean, when I've used it with my daughter, I opened the veil and I showed her when she was trying to write an essay, here's what a good framed response looks like. And I regenerated a few times on ChatGPT to show her there's several good answers, not one good answer. And then I challenged her to find the flaws because you can't rely on it. You can't copy and paste. So it can support us in so many ways, but requires engaging with it and demystifying it in a way that we all now have access to.
That's great. I want to move us for a second towards competitiveness, which I know is a focus of your work, and I think both of you are on the competitiveness working group. It seems like a key recommendation of the report was the need for increased investment in AI R&D, and I'm curious, how can we achieve that, and what are the potential benefits?
I'm happy to speak in general, not on behalf of committee. But I mean, AI, just to, in a sense, the algorithms and where we are as a country, so much of R&D does happen from US-based academia and institutes, and we are still ahead on that front in so many levels. But the key aspect we have to remember in the future as these models get bigger and bigger, and it is becoming, three things are going to become very important. One is talent, second is compute, and third one is how much data do you feed them to build these models. And this is where we have to actually think through first. Compute, to some extent, you can say, hey, America is the biggest economic superpower, so they probably have the budget if they want to build the best large language model in the world or invest in foundational model research in a big way. But we have to make that investment. And But more importantly, the talent war is something we should really think about, because right now, there are very few people who are actually investing in these research in a big, meaningful way. And you have to invest in education, especially at the university level, and also in the future for supporting some of these key research. And that's where I suspect still, as much as computer engineers are not going to be doing what they do in the future, but there are enough people who need to know how to train these AI systems, and some part of it we all will retool. And that is an area that I really hope we continue to double down on, ensuring that there is enough investment going into education and R&D at the university. And I speak purely from an individual capacity as well on that front. But I think these are some of the key things. Otherwise, I'm less worried that there is some other country that will take over in that way. But we do have to pay attention on investments in R&D and education for us to continue to lead in this one.
And it is such a crucial area, so thank you for speaking so well on why. And just to give you a glimpse into some of the challenges, on each of our working groups, we had one chair to lead that effort. For R&D, we had two, because on the one hand, we have a tremendous academic, we have many, but Dr. Ayanna Howard from Ohio, who is an expert in this field. On the other hand, it would have been more aspirational than a reflection of reality if we only had an academic lead on that. We had to have an industry companion. And so she co-chaired that with Ashley Lorenz, who is a former academic from Johns Hopkins, but currently at Microsoft, because that's the reality, that so much of this technological development in AI is happening on the industry side. And thank goodness for that, because we're all benefiting from it, but we need to make sure that there is government support for many reasons, to make sure that our country is competitive, to make sure that there's democratization of access and inputs. And so as a result, you'll see, if you want the cheat sheet in our report on the draft on page 12 and 13, we just list out the summary of what our objectives and action items are. And you'll see that 3 that we aligned on in year 1. And I should take a side note. So year 1 of a 3-year committee, we realized you don't always see a report, you don't often see recommendations. We understood there was so much urgency in this space that we wanted to do whatever we could to hurry up to the action items. And so year 1 is just a glimpse into the broad array of areas where we hope to weigh in and provide guidance and insight. But these were a few that we thought had to be said this year in this budget cycle at this point of AI development. And one piece that we wanted to take the opportunity to flag is that when we're talking about AI, we need to be talking about a multi-stakeholder process, and we need to be thinking of it from the technical side as we have, but the societal impacts as well. And so this field of socio-technical research really needs to be developed, and the government is in a prime position to be fueling that work. So we leaned in full scale on that objective. And you'll also see support for innovations that are underway. We didn't want to recreate the wheel, and we are fortunate that our work came about in a time when there's a few significant developments in this space that we took note of. One was the significant work underway at NIST with the risk management framework that was released in January, aligning for us best practices across industry, law agnostic, and user-friendly in so many ways. Likewise, we had the benefit of, just around the same time, of the NAIR report, the National AI Research Resource Task Force, which had some really luminary AI thinkers and research leaders who presented a report on the path forward on how to make sure that we lead in research and development and do so in an inclusive, responsible way. And so that was one action item that we really had no problem in fully endorsing with our broad cross perspective views.
I'm So you all know, because Miriam, you mentioned I spoke with the committee in Palo Alto, that I co-lead a project at Brookings called the Forum for Cooperation on AI. It's multinational expert roundtables. So I'm curious to hear about the work on international cooperation, and what you think is the potential in that area. What are the barriers, the potential for fragmentation internationally in AI, such as we've seen in privacy and data protection, and how does the U.S. overcome those? Swami, I think you were part of that working group, right?
Yeah. And I'm happy to, I can't be precise on page numbers like Miriam, but I'll say, first of all, there are a lot of actually countries who want to partner with us, and they share similar values in terms of what are the technologies we should build, and what are the necessary guardrails in which areas, and so forth, and how can we actually also double down together on R&D and so forth. So I think it totally makes sense from purely moving the field forward, and also especially when we share the same values, to also invest together on actually like common research in terms of cooperation, or also enable like multilateral AI diplomacy. So there are specific recommendations, maybe if I write, is it on like page 13? Probably Miriam, you can.
14, yeah.
14, I got one wrong, sorry. Okay. But I do think the precise recommendations that are in the report are just a reflection of where we are. But there are specific things we can do in terms of even like establishing joint R&D efforts and so forth. But these are the things I suspect we will unpack more and more in the future. But it would be very interesting. I don't know, Miriam, you want to add anything specific on this?
Yeah, I think we're all mindful as individuals, as NIACC members, as within our organizations, and I'd love to turn the question back to you, Cam, considering how much you talk and think about this. But we realize that we're talking about a technology that doesn't have borders, and so we have to be mindful that when we're talking about what the right regulation, mandate, safeguards should be, that we're talking about a technology that's going to be used in hands across the globe at the same time. And so for many reasons, it's imperative that we think about alignment, that we think about making it easier for those creating AI to be in compliance, to be clear on what the expectations are so that it can be built to our expectations and safeguards. And to allow this dialogue to happen so that there can be partnership. It's AI creation is expensive, it's time consuming, it requires significant resources. So to the extent that, as with space journeys, this is an area where we've gotten beyond thinking beyond our own province to understand that this is a moment to collaborate. And likewise with AI, we recognize we're in a similar space.
Yeah. If I could, I'd like to comment on that as well. I wasn't on that work group, but it might be additive to this part of the conversation. So I had the great fortune last year of literally traveling around the world and talking about AI in a lot of countries around the world. And a couple things I noticed, right? So I used the electricity analogy earlier. When you go to different nations, sometimes you need a different converter, right, in order to be able to get the electricity out of their walls. And there are different types of converters all over the world. And it's a standard. But what's important is that no matter how they generate their electricity, at some point you still need to get access to your email, right? And you got to tap into the wall. And so what comes to mind is, as Miriam pointed out, AI is without borders. However, it still needs a set of at least loosely coupled standards, much like we have with electricity. And so while we might have some different converters, if you will, on AI at some point, or some equivalent, we do need to have some sort of standardization around this. And so we can allow kind of the marketplace to do that, or governments can jump in and at least try to cooperate. So I just want to make sure people understand the why behind this, like why it's so important. The other thing to point out is that a lot of nations are seeing AI as part of kind of the next version of industrialization. Like a lot of younger nations especially missed out on being able to build vibrant economies based on industrialization. And so they see AI now as promise. Now there are some limitations in terms of footprint for data centers and all those sorts of things, but they see it as strategically important for the vibrancy of their nations. And they're also looking to see what steps the U.S. is taking. So this international collaboration piece is so very important. And as has been said out loud a few times, not necessarily just with like-minded nations, right? But maybe this creates an opportunity for extension of olive branches to those with whom we don't, completely share 100% of our values.
I love that electricity metaphor. Let's maybe spend a second on trustworthy AI and talk about themes related to transparency and privacy. Why is transparency important? How can it be achieved? What about privacy in AI systems? Who needs to do what to make sure that data is used in a way that's ethical?
No. Okay, what I will say is, I find it ironic, and literally in the last couple weeks, respectfully, where leaders of certain companies are coming out and they're communicating their commitment to trustworthy and responsible AI, but then meanwhile, the week before, they had decimated their ethical AI departments. So anyway, I just find that fascinating that, did you not know that this just happened in your company? And these are the CEOs.
But I'm assuming that he's not responsible for this?
No.
It is not my fault, people.
No, it's not. It wasn't Reggie, and it wasn't his company. But anyway, so that's just my take. Is first of all, what exactly is trustworthy and responsible AI? TBD, I guess. And then also, what is the commitment? I saw a big company's commitment to AI or trustworthy AI, and it was as if they took a salt shaker and their words were aspire to, strive to, aim to, and that was painful. That was painful to read.
Obviously in our individual comments here.
Right. Yeah,
Exactly.
Exactly right. Yeah. So in my individual capacity, I can talk a little bit about a couple things. So first, there are attempts at defining what trustworthy actually means, so we can put some real actionable, potentially even legal frameworks around that. But importantly, what that does is that gives guidance and signals to companies like ours to know what to build and what not to build and that sort. So that's vitally important. But in the absence of that explicit guidance, now we have some here in the U.S. from NIST with the AI Risk Management Framework as an example, could kind of outline some of that. But a lot of companies have taken it upon themselves. I know, I can speak for SAS at least. When we talk about trustworthiness, we've got a collection of 6 principles. The kind of the preeminent one being one around human centricity, to make sure that everything that we do is aligned with human agency, equity, et cetera. And so what we attempt to do is ensure that our principles are reflected in all that we do, our people, our products, our services, and that's my day job, right, outside of this doing the NIACC thing. And so there is some attempt in that, almost as a stopgap, as we wait for governments and all, because all this stuff is very complicated, guys. I mean, we shouldn't, think that it should happen with the snap of a finger. It's all very complicated, and it requires a lot of thought that goes into making sure that governments put these necessary guardrails in place.
First of all, I say this often, so if you ever heard me talk, the number one thing we all need to remember is machine learning systems make predictions. They don't make decisions. So And many times people translate them making predictions to machine learning systems that make predictions on what should I watch in Netflix. I really don't mind, but whether I should, whether it predicts saying like, okay, is there something wrong in my CT scan, so I have cancer or not? I probably want a radiologist. I shouldn't say probably. I want a radiologist to check. So you have to actually first know how to factor applications of AI where you need explicit human judgment as a mandatory thing. And that is very, very important. So just as a general frame. Then even in the cases where humans are, AI systems are just helping humans to even weed out all the data and signal, then you have to actually say, like, how do they know these machine learning predictions are actually interpretable or not? How do they know how they came to that conclusion or this prediction? That is a very important problem. And technically, that problem is only well understood in very simple form of machine learning algorithms, which are called like linear or gradient boosting algorithms and whatnot. With deep learning, we were just starting to figure that out. With transformer-based, these large language models, I don't think even people who build that can explain to you why it generated that response. That's the reason why when you ask the same question twice to these chatbots, it generates a different response. So we have to be really cognizant of then, are we going to use, let's say, a chatbot to generate like an international policy? God hope not. But nevertheless, we got to actually understand the limitations of these things. But we are investing significantly in academia industry, even within Amazon. Like we have our own tool that can actually inform why a machine learning prediction was made, let's say, for like well-understood algorithms based on what data set was fed. So anybody who's building a tool, let's say, using our tools like SageMaker, we have a tool called Clarify that will help for that. But that works only for some kind of algorithms. Transformer neural nets is like a whole different class. And so we have to actually really unpack purely at a engineering and scientific level what things we can measure. But as a catching part of it, we got to actually really separate which areas we are really aiming to really apply it in terms of high risk and really require that those really need human judgment. And these are just informing potentially what things needs to be there as well. That's how we start trusting these systems. And it is going to, I don't know, there will ever come a day where these systems automatically become radiologists. I highly doubt it forever as well. And that is where we start, not believing these systems. And I think we got to actually learn to segment these use cases too.
I'll wear two separate hats at different times for my answer. On the one hand, through NIACC, in thinking about trustworthy AI. So first of all, we all decided in our first meeting very quickly that when we were talking about AI, our definition was that it's artificial that is trustworthy, effective, responsible, inclusive. And so it informed all of our work to a person and to a committee, to a working group. That was our commitment. But we wanted to, for our first year, to have one working group specifically focused on it because we thought it was so important and because it was a novel discussion. We were fortunate that all of us, we've all been invited to NIST's process in building their AI risk management framework. Their deliberations are online. Their panels are very informative, instructive online. And each step of the way, they publish their draft for public comment, and we can see all the public comments. So as a result, there was deep trust in supporting the NIST framework, and we're so fortunate that they, first of all, defined trustworthy AI in a very thoughtful way. And they've done so much multi-stakeholder outreach to make sure that the various perspectives are involved in their framework so that if you follow the framework, you can identify socio-technical risks. Who could you be harming? For whom could this fail? And that leads me to my other hat, my Equal AI hat. When we're talking with companies, we have to remind them, you think you might be doing products and services, and historically, maybe generations, that's what you've been, but you're probably now an AI company because you're probably using AI in pivotal ways. And if you don't think so, just talk to your HR department or any other department, and they're probably using AI in some very impactful ways that will decide who is on your workforce, and how people in your space are functioning, let alone other consequential decisions. And so when we try to get them interested in trustworthy AI, in responsible AI, we explain there's 4 main reasons why you need to care about this. One is your employees don't want to be a part of artificial intelligence that is harmful, that is not responsible. And your employee base is pretty important. And so in order to retain and keep them happy and on board, you need to be thinking about that. Second of all, you need to be thinking about litigation. There is risk that has started to occur. We've started to see litigation. We've seen several regulatory bodies talk about the fact that there is going to be more regulation, more litigation in this space, a joint statement between the EEOC and the DOJ last year around this time, Department of Labor, CFPB, and so on, all the alphabet soup of the US. We talk about the fact that it's a broader consumer base. The more people who they include in their use cases, the more people who can use their AI. But the bottom line is, it's trust. It's brand integrity. You need to build trustworthy AI in order for people to trust it, because otherwise they won't buy it. So it's really deeply embedded within the nature of the technology that there's a mandate that it needs to be trusted, or we won't use it.
I have so many questions, but I'm also just aware of the time and I know how many questions we have online. So maybe if it works for you, we could take some questions from the room, and we have a colleague here who's monitoring what's happening online. It'd be great to get you in the conversation here.
Thank you. Did you want me to use it?
I think there's a mic coming.
And if you could just identify yourself too, and any affiliation.
Hi, yes, my name is Jill Shooker. I've been in government, mostly in foreign policy through the years, but I've also worked at the OECD, and now I'm working with UNESCO, and particularly in this area, I've had the opportunity to speak to the chair of this group, and also had the opportunity yesterday to listen to your open forum, open hearing, as well as hear the Secretary of Commerce, who made it quite clear that she wants more product and more quickly, that the genie is out of the bottle and it needs to, I think she called you the advisory group to the US government. So my question really is a simple one first, which is, when does the draft become a permanent report and accepted by the president, since you are there to advise the president? But also, there are a number of national plans that UNESCO has been working on, and UNESCO passed the first global recommendation on ethics in AI 2 years ago. You know that the EU has been extremely busy as well on this. So going back to what you hope NIACC will be doing in this second year, what is it? And how quickly, and what is the focus? I know you're speaking in your individual capacities, but you're all a member of a committee that's reporting to the president, and I'd like to know what that committee is going to put forward, particularly on ethics. Thank you.
Well, what we can say on behalf of NIACC, in terms of the timing where our report will become final, there are some copy edits underway. The process is it's submitted to the secretary and then submitted to the president. So the timing on that, as you can imagine, is well outside of our control, but I don't think that will be a long, lengthy process. But that is in our charter what the process is. A copy is also sent to various committees of Congress. So that, I think, is the process question. On the other question, what are we going to be doing? It's fair to say there are a few lines of effort that we have committed to. How quickly and in what form is under review. We certainly want to be helpful and understand that we cannot wait for a second year report in order to provide more. The nature of this policy will not, and this technology requires us to be more nimble and to speak more frequently. So we've heard that, and we're trying to be responsive. We have committed, as Reggie mentioned, we will be focused on education. We will be focused on international collaboration. We will be focused on inclusivity. We will be focused on workforce and human rights. And we will be focused on generative AI, and that will take a few different forms. We will share with you as the public, more when we know more, but we have committed and aligned to those priorities and hope to do those as well as others.
I saw a question at the right rear here, and then we'll take a question online and come back to the room.
My name is Brian Holland. I'm a student of data science at Georgetown, and I'm going from here to my data ethics class, so the timing is wonderful. And I did actually study electricity, so the fork in the socket analogy is just primo. I can tell you that from experience. But that seems like a self-enforcing rule, and what I've heard you talk a lot about the collaboration and competition and the global scope and scale. What I haven't really heard you talk about is enforcement. How are we going to keep more, just to put it bluntly, Facebook genocides from happening? How do we do that beyond just lawsuits and litigation? Because AI is just math, so you can't really say just don't do that math. Like whatever rules and boundaries are set up, there's going to be violators. There's going to be encroachment. How do you enforce those boundaries wherever they end up?
Who wants to take that?
Right.
Yeah, fair points.
You're the lawyer.
We have a few lawyers on the panel. No. I think within our report, in our draft report, you'll see there are various mechanisms that we've recommended. First of all, supporting parts of government that are in charge of that enforcement, making sure that they're sufficiently resourced, that the leadership positions within this area are filled and appropriately resourced. So I do think that's a first step in that direction. And, I don't know, there's not too much else we can say at this point because that's as much as we aligned on for the first year.
There's a lot of proceed at your own risk going on right now, and the people using these systems are aware of that and usually can critically analyze what it's spitting out. But as it filters down to more and more users, they will accept what's being said as face value. So who is responsible for possible disinformation, whether willing or unwilling, that comes from these LLMs? Is the responsibility on the provider or on the person to critically analyze what they're being told? And do you have any plans to suggest policy in either direction?
Yeah, certainly. That's an issue the EU is struggling with in terms of how to allocate responsibilities, up and down the value chain. Do you address that in the report in terms of how government should proceed with looking at the value chains?
Yeah. Well, so I think the explicit answer is it in the report? The answer would be no explicitly. However, I think the framing of the question is really important. One of the things that I learned, this is my first time doing government stuff, right? One of the things that I learned that I think is important is that there are a lot of laws that exist already. And while this is new technology, the harms incurred are kind of the same harms potentially, and it's really important to evaluate the current legal structure and see how that applies before you create a lot of net new. Now, that stuff take time, and I've inquired, like, how does that even happen? Like, people who deal with the mechanics, you know, say, yeah, that's possible, but here's like the 15 million things that you got to do. Like, and again, I'm not the DC guy, so I step away and say, okay. But I think it's important. That's an important step. Now, the proceed at your own cost, and I think is real, which is in part why I think the work that we are planning around awareness and education becomes really important. Because, you know, there's a proceed at your own risk with the sockets around here as well, right, to your point. And so we have to make sure that we raise the level of understanding about this stuff so that people can proceed in ways that will not be unintentionally harmful to themselves, right? So I think it's a both and. Yeah, enforcement's gonna play a part at some point, but first you gotta start with rules, right? And so I think all of that stuff is underway, and while it feels like it's really ambiguous, that's because it is. But there are a lot of folks around the world, literally, who are trying to figure this stuff out. This is the first time, folks, right, in human existence that we're dealing with this sort of stuff. So we do have to extend a little bit of grace as we try to figure some of this stuff out, so that we don't put structures in place that have unintended consequences that are every bit as harmful as those that we're attempting to avoid.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. Do we want to try to bring some of the folks from the virtual conversation into the room?
All right. We have one question from Brenda Kubica from Health IQ Consulting, who is asking about the risks associated with international cooperation, especially as you were mentioning, Reggie, specifically deploying AI tools that are imported from high-income countries and may thus contain biases from those countries to countries that are low or middle income. What risks do you foresee with that approach, and what advice do you have for mitigating those risks?
In our report, again, we leaned in on the risk management framework and talked about in our international space that that's something that we think should be a point of international collaboration. Our framework is intended to identify these harms. It's intended to be looking out for the end user, the small business, and to be applied by organizations large and small. And so, again, I think we're really benefited by the timing that in January we got this very substantive, thoughtful, comprehensive answer that can be applied in so many different ways and should be internationally and others.
I'll just give a practical example for how these LLMs, large language models, can get applied. In a way, you can say these large language models get these properties because of the amount of data that they are being fed, and all of them are trained based on, let's say, these web crawl that exists and whatnot. But imagine if they are trained, and many of them just primarily speak English. Now they can take on more and whatnot. But if there is a country that wants to take, let's say, historic literature for their specific literature and then train them specifically on it, many of them can take some of these open source LLMs and fine tune and so forth. So the thing we have to be cognizant of is there's not like, I don't believe there is going to be a world there will be like one AI or one GPT model that will rule the world. There are going to be actually multiple models, each for specific purpose that people are going to build, and there are going to be multiple companies and multiple nations building for different uses. So you have to be very cognizant of how do we enable them to build them in a safe and secure manner. And then they do have the ability to customize it in an easy way too. I'm purely speaking from an pure individual capacity, not on my day job or the NIACC part, but I do expect this to evolve in the same way, like many other technologies actually in the past have done. And so this will hopefully go in that way as long as they pay attention on how these things get trained.
Yes, the woman in the middle in the white sweater.
So since this is a policy discussion, I wanted to ask you guys if you had discussed the idea of repealing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and allowing existing liability laws to take force. Because the point that you made that you know, a lot of the problems that AI is causing are not new. there is an entire legal structure that exists to enforce harms that are done by systems that's being blocked right now by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And I know that this keeps coming up, and I know that it keeps getting knocked down. I don't know why, but since you're a policy discussion group and you're going to be making policy recommendations, I was wondering if maybe you could weigh in on why you are for or against that.
I don't know if people want to in their own individual capacity, but to answer your question did the committee discuss it? Because our audience is the president and the White House, and what you're talking about is legislative, that's not something that we saw within our mandate or took on.
I'm going to start taking two at a time, so maybe right here we have green jacket, pink jacket.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Alicia. I work for Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester from Delaware, and she leads a caucus called the Future of Work Caucus, which has a lot of things under its purview, but we're looking at AI as part of that. And I'm interested in some of the stuff you were mentioning about workforce, particularly K through 12 and then college and grad school as being an intervention point that does need attention, but also is not the most direct way to access the current workforce. So I'm wondering if you have recommendations about how to access the current workforce who are in jobs, who may not be going to community colleges or back to school. How do we reach them with information about these systems and what they need to know? And yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't know if anybody saw this piece, it was a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, about chatbots that are AI, they are AI augmented jobs now. So these customer service folks, it was about the telecom industry. The industry had engaged now these new AI chatbots that were actually grading every word that these customer service reps spoke. And it was interesting, we were talking about how AI can increase efficiencies for a business, and yes, that is true. But I thought it was fascinating in this piece that it was talking about how, in some cases, that this AI chatbot was causing so much stress that the people were quitting, that they were just leaving their jobs. And so to answer your question, from my perspective personally, it's a matter of asking the question. So what are employers doing? Because the article did also note how much more efficient the numbers were in customer service, but nobody seemed to be actually asking the question, so what are you doing, company X, to help your workers adapt to augmented jobs? Because a lot of people will say, no, we don't replace jobs, we augment them. And so then my question is, so how so? And so when an AI provider with a tool goes in and trains these workers and then they leave, then what? And those are the questions, to employers. So what exactly are you doing to not only prepare your employees and potentially upskill them, but also on the back end to ensure that people are not leaving these jobs simply because it's just, frankly, just stressing them out because they're just not familiar with that type of work.
Yeah,
So let's take a, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if I may, just I think the crux of that question has to do with engagement, right? How do you actually get people excited or invoked, right? And my personal experience is you have to show them what's in it for them. And it'd be great if we had kind of an ABCs for AI that spoke to individuals, from where they are and whatever paths they've chosen. But I think the channels through which we communicate with those folks then becomes really important. Like, how do you actually talk to them becomes the necessary step. And we're still trying to figure some of that out in terms of what levers does government have in order to do that. I'm a fan of the idea that AI is not a single entity's issue. This is a full ecosystem matter of concern, and so we've got to think about this in terms of what government can do, what employers can do, what schools can do, what individuals can do, right? And so I think this is, if any, this is an opportunity for us to have an all hands on deck sort of moment. And so I don't want to get on soapbox, but point is engagement and finding the channels through which to engage, I think, becomes the path to answering that.
So let's take a couple of final questions together. and then we're going to have to wrap it up. So starting with the gentleman with on the aisle there with the striped socks.
Thank you, Pam. Although I would like to defer to the pink jacket. Did you get your question in?
We haven't gotten your question in, so why don't you ask
Okay.
your question?
All right,
and we'll
I'll
come
ask-
next to Pink
We'll
Jacket.
take those
All right.
two questions.
All right, thank you. I'm Alan Rawle from the law firm of Sidley Austin. I'd like to come back to the question of harms. And Ms. Vogel, you mentioned that your framework includes a element to identify harms. Is your group, is NIACC or some other government entity or NGO actually looking to identify concrete harms from, I would suppose maybe general purpose artificial intelligence rather than specific purpose, if you think that's a relevant distinction to identify harms. But for example, we know that hallucination, giving inaccurate results, that would be a harm because people will be deceived. Same with deep fakes. Are there other actual concrete harms that are being identified? And is somebody responsible for consolidating those and reporting on them? Because otherwise, how do you establish effective and appropriate rules if you don't really know what the harms are?
On the aisle over here. Oh, I thought you had a question.
We're going to take two at a time. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Is this on? All right. Great conversation. My name is Gretchen Stewart. I work for Intel Corporation, so we've been talking about all the software. I have to tell you, I, of course, want to talk about the hardware. I'm the chief data scientist for our public sector. And my questions are really around security and sustainability. So I'm curious because those large language models use a tremendous amount of energy. If you all have talked about that and if that's part of what your potential suggestions are. And then also, you're talking about privacy, but data security is really important. So I'm curious from the perspective of both of those. So thank you.
To answer the question, have we talked about it? We've thought about it. We're deeply concerned about it, and it's something we're planning to take on. Thank you for raising the important point of when we're thinking about the impacts of artificial intelligence, it's society, it's underserved communities, it's the users, it's the employees, it's the environment. So we really need to have the broadest aperture if we're thinking about who's being impacted by this revolutionary technology and who can benefit. I mean, each of those perspectives I just mentioned could also benefit from artificial intelligence if we're mindful and intentional about how we operate at this moment, which leads to your question. From a I don't have a NIACC answer for you with my equal AI hat. I mean, one thing I think is so important to think about as we're thinking about what the risks are, as Reggie mentioned before, this is not wholly new territory. So much of this is addressed or should be or could be addressed by laws on the books because, the laws were intended to draft, it's intentional that laws are supposed to impact innovations and new questions as they go, and there are so many of those here. So one thing that I think is really important, again, this is not my NIACC hat, this is something we think about all the time at Equal AI, is what are the harms and opportunities here that are handled by traditional fora and laws? Where are the product liability questions here? What are the contract, when is it a material breach that your artificial intelligence has failed in some way? When are there constitutional issues and so forth? The EEOC and DOJ, as I mentioned, have talked about the fact that their civil rights laws apply in this setting when you're using AI in your HR and employee functions. The Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, is applicable whether it's an AI-based determination or human. Like either way, the laws will equally apply. So I think one thing that's helpful is for us to parse out which of these questions do current laws on the books, current regulations, current norms and standards already apply. Let's make sure that there's clarity and move forward on those, and then look at the new questions where we need new fora, new regulations, et cetera.
Okay, lightning round. I would love to hear from each of you one thing that you learned in the course of this work in the last year that surprised you.
That's not much of a light day.
Okay, I'll start. The enormity of opportunity for improvement.
I guess I had to. I'm very optimistic. The biggest thing I learned, again, I come from purely an engineering background, the diversity of such an amazing group, and the approach with which this group took to actually problem solve. They didn't come with like it's all going to be Matrix or Terminator doomsday scenario. We are in this to go figure out how to make this technology and how to shape it is really refreshing for someone who is participating in this policy group style setting for the first time ever. So I thought that was very refreshing and really looking forward to contributing more in year two.
Yeah, I didn't know what to expect when we started. And I think it's safe to say that I'm heartened that they are really smart is probably not the right label, but good-hearted people attempting to figure some of these things out. And yeah, there are 26 members, but there's a whole lot of people not just supporting us, but in government. And there's some overlapping activities as well that I guess I didn't appreciate when I first started that are also kind of tapped into this thread of AI. And so just there's kind of an enormity to it, to Susan's point. There is certainly room for improvement. There are certainly gaps in government and inefficiencies and all that good stuff. But there are some really good people working on this, and we're trying to get it right. So.
Yeah, Swami and Reggie took my answer. I'm so heartened by the intentionality and the deep commitment, the passion of every single person on our committee. You always see in DC and elsewhere that people stand where they sit, and I've seen people go well beyond where they sit currently, bringing their whole life's experience, thinking about their children, thinking about the future and what they want it to look like. And I've really been just so honored to work with people who have deep expertise and passion to make sure that we take this opportunity to get this right. And likewise, government policymakers have had a bad rap and not being tech savvy and whether it's policymakers we've talked with in the U.S. or abroad, I think it's fair to say that there is a real sophistication emerging, both understanding the importance of addressing this issue, but also in understanding the nuance and making sure that they're navigating this moment appropriately.
All right. Well, I want to thank our audience online as well as in the room. And thank Jessica and thank you, panelists. We will look forward to the final report whenever it comes out and to the work in year 2 and year 3. So please thank our panelists.
Thank you.